Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Get ready, because today we are really going deep. Full immersion into the life of Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. Tumultuous, definitely.
Yeah.
Consequential, absolutely.
We've been digging through, well, a whole stack of source material, historical accounts, researched articles, trying to get a real picture of him, his ideas, his impact.
And it's interesting because for the longest time, Hamilton was sort of the less famous founder, you know?
Right. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, they got the main spotlight.
Exactly. But that's really changed lately. New scholarship and, well, you can't ignore the musical.
Oh, no, you can't. It brought his story roaring back.
Definitely surged into the spotlight.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to pull out the key insights from all this material. We want you to understand Hamilton's, let's say, complex personality.
Mm-hmm. Complex is a good word for it.
And his vision for America, pretty ambitious stuff. And maybe figure out why his story is hitting home for so many people right now.
There are definitely some surprising turns. His life was anything but dull.
Okay, so where do we start? The beginning seems obvious, but with Hamilton, it's dramatic right from the outset.
It really is. The sources immediately hit you with how unlikely his rise was. Not born into wealth or connections like, say, Jefferson or Washington.
Not at all. His origins were incredibly tough. Poverty, remote Caribbean island Nevis.
And the stigma. The sources use blunt language, reflecting the time. He was illegitimate.
That famous description, bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman. Stark.
Brutal. No father figure around, and then his mother dies when he's just, what, 14?
14. Think about facing the world at that age with that label basically alone.
It's staggering. But what's equally staggering is the ambition you see. Even then, this, ferocious hunger for a chance.
Yeah, that quote from his early letters the sources mention, actually wishing for a war so he could prove himself.
It's intense. Not your typical teenage yearning. It speaks volumes about his drive, maybe desperation too.
And it points to something core about him, right? That perseverance.
Absolutely. Turning obstacles into opportunities. The sources really hammer this lemons into lemonade thing with him from day one.
His education wasn't exactly traditional at first.
No. His mother taught him basic literacy, but the real practical learning came from work.
Right, working in that merchant's counting house. Young kid, but learning business, finance, trade.
Hands-on. Not just theory. And the writing that comes up again and again in the sources. Even as a teen, his letters show talent.
That writing skill was clearly his ticket.
It was the key. It led directly to his first big break. He was, what, 16?
16, yeah. A massive hurricane hits the island.
Devastating storm. And young Hamilton writes this incredibly vivid account for the local paper.
Anonymously at first, right, under a pseudonym.
Yeah, but the writing itself was so powerful, so mature, it blew people away. The local leaders, the elders.
They saw this spark, this intellect.
Exactly. They realized his potential was bigger than the island, so they actually took up a collection.
Pooled their money to send him abroad for education. Amazing.
Truly life-changing. A direct result of his talent and their belief in him. He took the chance.
Sailed for the American colonies.
And never looked back. Never returned to the Caribbean. That storm report was the launching pad.
So he lands in New York, probably late 1772, early 73, still just teenager, maybe 17.
And heads straight for King's College, now Columbia University.
And you have to picture the scene, right? This isn't the USA yet, it's British colonies.
Firmly part of the British Empire. But things are getting tense.
Very tense. Arguments over taxes, regulations, the crown trying to recoup costs from the 7 Years' War.
And the big names are already involved. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, stirring up resistance.
Franklin's even over in London trying to smooth things over, keep the peace.
But the revolutionary ideas are bubbling up, especially in cities like New York, and definitely on campuses like King's.
Liberty, rights, consent of the governed, all that Enlightenment talk.
And Hamilton, this super smart, super ambitious immigrant kid, walks right into this intellectual firestorm.
And doesn't just watch from the sidelines.
Not a chance. By 17, 18, he's writing, passionately defending the revolutionary cause.
The sources mention 3 major pamphlets he wrote in just a couple of years while still a student.
Yeah, and these weren't just, homework assignments. They were powerful arguments against the status quo, urging New Yorkers to join the fight.
What's really striking is how radical his ideas were for the time, especially for someone so young.
Oh, absolutely. The sources point out he went right at the foundations, questioning the divine right of kings, this idea that God appoints monarchs
Which was a deeply rooted belief.
Totally.
Yeah.
And instead, he's pushing these Enlightenment concepts.
Yeah.
Humans are inherently equal in origin, nature, power, rights.
No one naturally rules over anyone else unless people agree to it. Consent.
Pure lock, but applied directly to the crisis with Britain, forcefully argued.
And it's through this public writing, taking a stand, that he starts to forge his identity.
Yes. The sources note he starts signing his own name, identifying not just as a kid from the Caribbean, but as an American.
So the pen leads to the sword, eventually.
Inevitably. When the fighting starts, he joins the Continental Army. But his biggest impact, initially, isn't on the front lines.
No, it's his brain, his organizational skills, that writing talent again. Washington snaps him up.
Right, as an aide-de-camp. Basically, Washington's chief of staff, his right-hand man, confidential secretary.
A critical position. Drafting endless letters, orders, reports for the commander-in-chief.
This is where that writing ability becomes crucial on a huge scale. The sources really emphasize how close he got to Washington.
Earned his total trust. Diligence, smarts.
Sheer intellectual horsepower. They say he got so tuned into Washington's thinking.
He could practically write as Washington.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Draft things that Washington would just review and sign. Minimal changes needed. He was channeling the general's voice.
And a lot of that writing was aimed at the Continental Congress, right? Begging for support.
Constantly. The sources paint a grim picture of the Army's situation. Brutal winters, no money, no food.
Morale plummeting. Disease and exposure killing more soldiers than battles did sometimes.
It was desperate. The Congress, under the weak Articles of Confederation, just couldn't deliver. They had no real power to tax or demand resources from the states.
So the army was always on the edge of collapse.
Always. The sources argue pretty strongly that without French help, money, ships, troops, secured by guys like Franklin, the whole thing might have failed.
And Hamilton's seeing all this firsthand, the weakness of the central government, its inability to support the war.
And it's profoundly shaping his views. He's getting deeply frustrated with the Articles, seeing the absolute need for a stronger national government that can actually function.
But at the same time, that ambition is still there. He doesn't just want to be behind a desk.
No, he craves a field command, wants to prove himself in combat, lead troops.
Washington must have been reluctant to let him go. He was too valuable.
Exactly, which led to friction. The sources mention a specific disagreement. Maybe Hamilton felt slighted.
And he resigns from Washington's staff? Impulsive?
It seems like it. Proud, ambitious, maybe a bit hot-headed, willing to walk away even from Washington.
Though they patch things up later, and he does get his command eventually.
Right. But what's amazing is, even during the war, his mind is working on the next stage.
Thinking about, after independence, how to build the country.
Deeply. He's doing serious intellectual work on designing America's financial system, while the war is still raging.
So while others are focused purely on fighting, he's drafting economic blueprints.
In his letters, yeah.
Yeah.
Arguing for a system to manage finance, strengthen the government, establish credit, handle the war debts.
Make the U.S. credible on the world stage.
Exactly. And he's proposing specifics. A national bank, like a central bank.
To issue stable money, give loans, manage government debt.
All of it. And this is where you get that famous, kind of startling idea about debt.
Debts are the glue of our nation. It sounds so counterintuitive today.
Right. We think of debt as bad. But his insight was strategic. If the federal government took on all the war debt, national and state debts...
It creates a shared interest.
Precisely. The creditors, often wealthy, influential people, would then have a direct stake in the federal government's success and stability. They'd want it to survive, to get paid back.
So it wasn't just about paying bills, it was about binding the nation together financially, establishing credit.
Yes. Critical for future borrowing and international respect.
Where did he get these ideas? Did he just invent them?
No. The sources are clear he was looking at existing models, especially Great Britain.
He saw how their sophisticated banking system let them fund wars and empire.
He did. He wasn't just copying, though. Adapting it for America. And reading the Enlightenment thinkers, of course.
Like David Hume on public credit, Adam Smith.
Yes, but here's a key point the sources make. He read Adam Smith, but he didn't totally buy into the pure free market idea.
How so? Smith argued for minimal government interference, right? The invisible hand.
Generally, yes. But Hamilton looked at America, young, undeveloped, competing with Europe, and thought, no, the government has to step in.
He wanted active government policy.
Definitely. Things like tariffs on imports to protect new American industries. Incentives, subsidies for manufacturers.
So build up a domestic industrial base. Don't just rely on Europe.
That was the strategic goal. Reduce dependence, create self-sufficiency, which was a very different vision from
Thomas Jefferson,
Yeah.
who wanted a nation of farmers.
Exactly. Jefferson envisioned an agrarian republic. Hamilton saw an industrial future, both rooted in the Enlightenment, but different strands. That fundamental disagreement starts early.
Okay, so back to his military career for a moment.
Hmm.
After leaving Washington's staff, he does get that command,
He does, and distinguishes himself at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781.
which was the decisive battle, really.
Huge turning point. The sources stress it showed American capability, broke British resolve, and forced London to the negotiating table. Peace was coming.
And once the war was winding down around 1782, Hamilton shifts gears completely.
Yeah, independence won. Now the focus is, how do we build this thing, make it last?
And his next move is law school, or studying law.
He studies law intensely and sets up a practice in New York. Smart move, gives him a new platform, different expertise for the political battles ahead.
And the sources mention this is when he starts regularly running into Aaron Burr in court.
Yep, just lawyers crossing paths then.
Yeah.
No idea what was coming down the road.
Meanwhile, the country itself is in rough shape.
Rough is putting it mildly. Under the Articles of Confederation, it's barely holding together. 13 states acting like separate little countries.
Massive war debts, states taxing each other's goods, foreign trade problems.
And a central government with basically no power. Couldn't tax, couldn't enforce anything. The sources note that 13-year gap between the Declaration and the Constitution, that tells you how hard it was to get unified.
And seeing this chaos just confirms Hamilton's belief.
Absolutely cements it. We need a strong federal government, or this whole experiment fails. He becomes a leader among those pushing for a stronger union, the Federalists.
Which leads him to team up with James Madison and John Jay.
A crucial alliance, their goal. Convince people we need a new constitution, a real national government.
And the result is the Federalist Papers, one of the most important political documents ever.
Incredible achievement. 85 essays, published anonymously, arguing for the new constitution.
And Hamilton wrote the bulk of them, like 52?
52 out of 85.
Yeah.
The sources emphasize his insane work ethic, churning these complex essays out, like one every few days while also practicing law. Tireless.
What were the core arguments they were making in those papers?
Basically showing how a stronger union was better for everyone. Better national security, better economy through free trade between states, more political stability.
And they had to explain why the articles weren't working.
Oh, yeah. Detailed critiques, and they explain the new structure, why a strong executive was needed, but also how separation of powers, checks and balances, and independent judiciary would prevent tyranny.
Making the case for the whole system.
Persuasively. And it worked. They were key in getting crucial states like New York on board. By 1788, the Constitution is ratified.
Just 5 years after the war ended. And Jefferson, interestingly, was in France through all this Constitution writing and debating.
Watching from afar. A very different perspective than being in the thick of it like Hamilton and Madison.
So, Constitution ratified. Now you need a government. And everyone knew who had to lead it.
George Washington. But he wanted to retire.
And Hamilton played a big part in changing his mind.
Huge part. The sources talk about years of letters from Hamilton to Washington, even before the Constitution. Arguing the Union was fragile, only Washington could hold it together.
Calling him the rock of the building.
Things like that. You're the one who can save us. Direct, urgent appeals. And Washington finally, reluctantly, agreed.
And Washington knew exactly who he needed for the toughest job in the new cabinet.
First Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The perfect role for him to finally implement all those financial ideas he'd been developing. He served for 6 years.
6 transformative years. This is where he really builds the engine of the American economy.
Pretty much from scratch, taking those wartime ideas and making them reality.
Okay, break down the big policies. First, assumption.
Right. His proposal that the federal government should assume or take over not just the national debt, but all the individual state debts from the war.
Which caused a huge fight, didn't it? States like Virginia had paid off a lot of their debt already.
Exactly. Madison, his old ally from the Federalist Papers, led the opposition. Why should Virginia taxpayers bail out less responsible states?
But Hamilton had a bigger goal than just paying debts.
It was political genius, in a way. Making the federal government the main creditor elevated its power over the states. And crucially, it tied the wealthy bondholders directly to the federal government's success. gave them skin in the game.
And that led to the famous compromise. Hamilton gets assumption.
In exchange for agreeing to locate the permanent national capital in the South, on the Potomac, high-stakes deal-making.
Next up, the Bank of the United States.
His report on a national bank, modeled on the Bank of England, but a public-private mix. Government owned 20%, private investors 80%.
And Jefferson hated this idea too.
Hated it. Saw it as concentrating too much power in private hands, potentially corrupting too European.
But Hamilton argued it was essential and constitutional.
Yes, under the necessary and proper clause, a broad interpretation the Federalists favored. He argued it was vital for managing government money, issuing stable currency, providing credit, handling the debt. Basic infrastructure for a modern economy.
Which links to creating the U.S. Mint, right, standard coins.
Exactly. Getting rid of the chaotic mix of Spanish dollars, British pounds, state notes, creating a single American currency.
He also pushed for easier trade.
Yeah, breaking down trade barriers between states, creating a single national market, and managing foreign trade more effectively.
But the government needed money, taxes.
Federal taxes were necessary, and one of the first big ones was the excise tax on whiskey in 1791.
That didn't go smoothly. The Whiskey Rebellion.
No, major resistance, especially from farmers out west who used whiskey-like currency. Washington himself had to lead troops to put down the rebellion, showed the challenge of enforcing federal law.
And then his big vision for industry, the Report on Manufactures.
A landmark document, arguing for tariffs to protect American industries, government support for manufacturing.
Yeah. What was the goal?
Reduce dependence on Europe, build America's own industrial capacity, diversify the economy beyond just farming, which he thought was too vulnerable.
And the sources say these policies actually worked, had a lasting impact.
Profoundly. Laid the foundation for America's industrial rise. The sources even point out FDR looked back at Hamilton's ideas during the Great Depression. His pragmatic use of government to stimulate the economy seemed more relevant than Jefferson's ideals at that moment.
So his goal as Treasury Secretary was clear. Make America strong, industrial, financially sound, not just a collection of farms.
That was the vision he relentlessly pursued.
But after 6 intense years, he steps down in 1795. Why leave such a powerful position?
Sources say he was exhausted. The political fights were brutal. And frankly, he needed to make money. Public service didn't pay well, and he had a family. He went back to his law practice.
Still stayed influential, though. Helped Washington write the farewell address.
Oh, yes. Remained a key advisor.
It's interesting he never went for the presidency himself.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Maybe he knew he wasn't popular enough nationwide. Too controversial. Or maybe he felt his best role was shaping policy, being the brain behind the throne.
Hard to say. He did back John Adams over Jefferson in '96, even though they didn't always get along. Pragmatic choice.
Saw Adams as the better bet to continue the Federalist direction.
Then comes the scandal that really damaged him personally, the Reynolds affair.
Yeah, this casts a long shadow. An affair he had in the early 90s with a married woman, Maria Reynolds.
How did it blow up into a public scandal years later?
It gets messy. Her husband, James Reynolds, gets arrested for some shady financial dealings. To save himself, he, or maybe others involved with him, approach Hamilton's political enemies.
The Republicans.
Right, claiming Hamilton was corruptly involved with Reynolds financially.
And the proof was money Hamilton had paid Reynolds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the sources suggest this might have been a setup all along, that James and Maria possibly colluded. She starts the affair, James discovers it, then blackmails Hamilton.
Demanding money to keep quiet?
Yeah, silence money. The sources estimate Hamilton paid maybe $1,300, a lot back then, maybe like $30,000, $40,000 today. Drained his personal funds.
So when the corruption charges hit, based on those payments,
Hamilton's cornered. Deny everything and risk them uncovering the affair anyway, or admit the affair to prove the money was blackmail, not corruption.
and he chose to admit the affair, publicly.
In that astonishing 95-page Reynolds pamphlet, spilled everything, explicit letters, the whole blackmail story.
Just to clear his name on the financial charge.
That's how crucial his public financial integrity was to him. He saved that, but at a devastating personal cost. His reputation, his family's privacy. Eliza, his wife, likely learned the full extent from the pamphlet.
Wow. A really complex, maybe self-destructive decision. Shows what he valued most, I guess.
Public honor over private peace, it seems.
And all these political fights, the personal attacks, eventually lead to the ultimate tragedy, the feud with Aaron Burr.
Yeah, that rivalry had been building for years. Law courts, New York politics, national stage.
Hamilton really distrusted Burr, didn't he? Saw him as unprincipled, Dangerous.
Deeply. And he actively worked against him. Most famously in the 1800 election tie between Jefferson and Burr. Hamilton urged Federalists in the House to back Jefferson, his ideological opponent, just to stop Burr.
Called Burr a Catiline, like the Roman conspirator.
He did. Then later, when Burr ran for New York governor, Hamilton publicly attacked his character again.
And Burr had finally had enough.
Enough was enough. Felt his honor was destroyed. He issued the challenge. A duel.
July 11, 1804, Weehawken, New Jersey.
Across the river, yeah. Less strict dueling laws there. And horrifically, the sources point out, the same place Hamilton's son Philip died in a duel just a few years earlier, defending his father's honor.
Chilling. And Burr's shot hit Hamilton.
Mortally wounded. Died the next day. He was only 47.
The sources say he forgave Burr before he died.
Reportedly, yes. But the duel ended Hamilton's incredible life and career. And it destroyed Burr's political future, too. He became an outcast.
It seems so. Pointless from our perspective. Dueling over insults.
Utterly irrational to us now. But it was their code, twisted as it seems. The sources joke, maybe people 200 years from now will look back at some of our ways of settling disputes and find them just as bizarre.
A fair point. So, after his death, Hamilton's legacy was complicated.
For a long time, yeah. He wasn't forgotten, but maybe overshadowed by Jefferson, Washington. The agrarian ideal held sway for a while. His complexities were often highlighted.
But that's changed. This huge resurgence of interest recently.
Definitely. New biographies offered fresh takes. And then the musical phenomenon.
Hamilton, it put him right back in the center of the conversation. That song, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story.
Perfectly captures it. History depends on who's telling the story and when they're telling it.
And the sources suggest his rise now is partly because our perspective has shifted.
That's the argument. As society reevaluates the past, figures change places.
Like Jefferson facing more criticism over slavery.
Right, which might make Hamilton's flaws the affair. His ambitions seem more like understandable human failings to some modern audiences compared to complicity in something like slavery.
It's about what a particular era chooses to focus on or forgive.
Exactly. And we absolutely have to mention his wife, Eliza.
Her role was critical, wasn't it, after his death?
Immense. She lived for another 50 years, tirelessly collecting his papers, defending his reputation, ensuring his story could be told. She fought to preserve his legacy against his rivals.
And his own story, the immigrant who made it against all odds, that resonates strongly today, too.
Very much so. The ultimate outsider who became the ultimate insider. It all reinforces that history is constantly being reinterpreted through the lens of the present.
Okay, let's wrap this deep dive up. Key takeaways from the sources on Hamilton.
Well, that incredible, improbable rise, his absolutely central role in creating America's financial and government structure, that brilliant but flawed, complex personality.
Ambition mixed with self-sabotage sometimes. And this whole modern rediscovery of his importance.
His major contributions stand out. Pushing the states to unite under a strong federal government, the Federalist Papers making that case.
Building the financial system, the bank, the currency, managing the debt, and that vision for an industrial America.
Ideas and systems that, as the sources stress, still shape the U.S. profoundly today.
You see his legacy on Wall Street, in the power of the federal government. His vision, in many ways, won out.
It really did, which brings us back to that idea of looking back at history.
Right, given how we reevaluate historical figures based on our current values, elevating some, questioning others.
Here's the final thought for you to chew on. How might people 200 years from now look back at us?
At our leaders today, our society, our conflicts. What will they find baffling or unacceptable about our time?
Something to think about, definitely.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.